So the path to exaltation is humility. What are some of those rights that we hold on to? And we mentioned this earlier. What are some of those rights we hold on so dearly? Right to our wages, don't we? We hold on to money. I've earned that. I've earned the right to go do this. I remember my wife and I were reading the 5 love languages once, and they listed them all off, a book we read right after we got married. I said there needs to be a 6th one in the time. That there's really nothing quite, I know to me, as valuable personally as my time. That I hate to have it wasted. I would rather waste money. I would rather waste just about anything other than time. That I value my time with my wife. I value my time with my son. I value my time in study. We might feel the right to respect because of our athletic prowess or our position or some kind of office that we hold. We might expect rights of privacy, that I have these certain things, but choose now to submit those rights for the right to serve. We talked about last week the gifts that we got. You want to remember those 2 gifts Paul said that we got? We got the right to believe and to suffer. Those were the gifts that we got. Paul tells us that. Here, he's also telling us we have the right to serve. Now, we look at that in a worldly way. It's like, whoa, Paul, you're really giving me a hard time here. I got the right to suffer, or I get the right to serve. I get the gift of suffering. I'm feeling like I'm getting the raw deal here. Until you realize what Paul is telling us, that God's ways are not the way of the world. If you think like the world and you think what they have there, it's going to present a problem. Okay? The next thing we work into is the area where I started to double check and triple check and start going back in on myself here, is the whole idea in chapters 12 and 13. I'll start off by reading that. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. This is where I tell you something that I hate to tell anybody, but I'm going to tell it for you in front of God and YouTube and everybody. I always understood this wrong. I always approached this like, approach your salvation with fear and trembling because you have no business even thinking about it. You have no business even approaching it. You have no business even thinking about it. And as I got to this, I started doing some studying, and I started digging into this, and I started going back and looking to what Paul was saying, and he's not saying that. When he presents this idea of working out your salvation, he's coming back to this idea that everything you do with God through you. It's like that misquoted phrase we hear all the time, right? God will never what? Give you more than you can handle. What part do they leave out of that phrase or that quote over and over again? Okay? He will never, he's talking about temptation, and he's also saying with God's strength. When you have God's strength, there's nothing that you can't handle. There's no temptation you can't handle. There's nothing you can. Is there anything, let me front load my question, is there anything God can't do? Can he change your age? Can he make monkeys fall out of the sky? Can he make the whole planet just disappear? He can do whatever he wants to do. It's his game, it's his ball, right? He makes the rules for it. So if we're a vessel and he is working through us, if his will is being done through us, if he chooses to use us as an instrument, is there anything with the strength of God that we can't do? If God wishes it, if God wills it, if it's his desire for it to happen, is it going to happen? Yes. And he can use whatever instrument he wants to use. He can use me, he can use a kazoo, he could use a fire hydrant. He can use whatever he wants, but he's God. So, we come to this idea that instead of the holy and the pure is accomplished with God's will through us. And if you go back and you start to look at how these things are phrased time and time again, I put some study verses up there to talk about this, that this whole idea of God's will is being accomplished through us. If we are truly functioning as His tools, if we are truly emptied ourselves and we're moving forward, there's nothing that can't be done through us. We're constantly skeptical about what could be done or what couldn't be done, or God works that way or God doesn't work that way. God can do anything He wants. The fear and trembling has to do with being cautious. Okay? Fear. Be cautious that you are choosing God rather than yourself. Work out your own salvation with fear. When you are thinking about what you're doing, and I'm not talking about, let me be clear, I'm not saying you can work your way into heaven. You can't. There's one person that can get you right into heaven. Let me be clear to begin with. Who is that? Jesus. But Jesus is going to work through you, isn't He? Be fearful. Be cautious about what you do. Are you doing it because you want to do it? Because your will, it's your desire? Or have you emptied yourself to God? Have you let Him fill you? And are you performing His will? As you think of this, perhaps some of you would be more comfortable with me saying, think of this as your walk. Let's put it on a smaller scale. Sometimes salvation gets big for people to wrap their minds around. Think of your walk about each choice you're making. Make each choice with fear and trembling. Are you doing it of yourself, for yourself, or are you doing it for God? Have you sought Him? Have you looked to Him? Or is it instead a choice out of your own desires? But there's also that word trembling there. When we hear trembling, when we talk about trembling, it's talking about having respect for God and the consequences of our actions. So Paul tells us to work out our salvation, and by extension, or maybe as precursor, however you would like to figure it out, our walk with Him, work it out. Work out your relationship with Him. Work out your walk with Him. Work out your relationship with Him. With fear, with prayer and study and knowledge of Him, and trembling. Having such a respect for God that you realize that each choice has to be tied to your actions. That there's going to be something good or bad as a consequence to your actions. So, walking in the Word is the goal. If you remember from Philippians chapter 1, verse 27, it said to us, "Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, and that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for faith of the gospel." Walking in the Word is the goal, to be worthy of the gospel. We talked about that last week. The measuring stick Paul's giving us is like-mindedness. He said it in chapter 2, verse 2. And considering others more important than ourselves. Talked about that in chapter 2, verse 3. The danger is trying to accomplish this through the flesh. We've already discussed that the flesh is sin. That we need to choose the holy and the pure. And that the holy and pure cannot be accomplished simply by us. Arrogance leads us to push the limits. To too much things to do, to do in our own strength. Conversely, having too low a view of ourselves is not helpful either. Okay? It makes us doubt God's love, His purposes for us. John 15:5 will make my point for what I'm saying. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn there. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. According to John, who is Jesus? He's the vine. We're the what? And that vine feeds us, strengthens us. gives us the nourishment we need, puts into us what we have, and ultimately, because the vine is so strong, we bear what? Fruit. We create something. What happens if I snap that branch off the vine? Can it function without it? No. You're producing fruit from the vine. It is working through you to create the fruit. Let's skip ahead a little bit in Philippians to chapter 4, verse 13. Where Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The same idea comes up again, that anything can be done. If I can empty myself and seek God and be filled with His purpose in my life, and be humble before Him, and do things not because I desire it, but because He desires it, I can do all things because God strengthens me. Now, let me be clear, because what struck me today was to go back to the Greek. The Greek on this, I have much room on this board. The Greek word that I want to talk about is not. Sounds like not. It means all. And I went into Strong's Concordance in Greek, and I looked up, what does Paul mean by all? Now, bear with me for a second. I want you to understand the extensiveness of what I understood this. Knock means all, every, all things, all respect, all ways, any at all, anyone, anything, continually, entire, every kind, every respect, every way, everyone, everything, forever, perfectly, and whole. And each time, and I went back and checked this, each time Paul talks about God being able to do all, or any version of all, the translators of the Bibles translate that word not 4 or 5 different ways, but every time it means this, that God can do all, I can do all things through God that strengthens me. He is my vine, I am the branch, I can do nothing separate from Him. But I can do all things through God. He's God. And so all things can be done through Him. So we go back into Philippians chapter 2. And so we're left in an unusual position. We have the phrase, work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Why am I working out my salvation with fear and trembling? God is the one at work, not you. God is the vine. He is the one that is feeding. You're the tool. My hammer didn't build my patio. I did. But I used it as a tool. It was able to build it with me working through it. Not if it resisted me the whole way, but because it was willing. Okay? For His good, and why is God the one at work? For His good pleasure. He does these things. He does all of these things because it brings Him pleasure for His children to become closer to Him, to know Him, to have a better relationship to Him. I gave the example a second ago of working on a house. And this idea that Paul gives us of working on our salvation, working on a relationship with God, working on our walk with Him. And like any example, it's not perfect, but when I was working on my house a while back, when I was working on it and I'd run into a problem, the first thing I would do is I'd reach for a manual or an instruction guide. Do you have a manual or instruction guide you can turn to? The Bibles, the ones you're holding. So God's speaking to you in that. When that didn't work, or maybe the pictures weren't quite clear enough, or the examples that were going over my head, I asked for guidance. I call a 1-800 line, or I call up a professional, ask a few questions. Do you have a 1-800 line you can call? Real easy, right? It's toll-free and everything. Prayer. Or if not in prayer, also in fellowship. By talking to your brothers and sisters in the Lord that can share ideas.